Thank you very much, Professor Benito. Thanks, everyone. I don't know which one's better. Let me just do this. Thanks very much for inviting me, as every year. It's always good to come to Europe, especially at this point in time. You want to be out of the US as much as you can. Also, thank you to Chiara. I don't know, she's probably working right now, doing something else.
Yes,
but
in the toilet.
No, but I
don't know.
I appreciate very much the invitation. I'm excited to be here with you. This is really it's good for me as somebody who teaches in the US to get also not only the feedback, from Italian master students, but basically from all over the world, because I know that you are literally from all over the world, right? So the next about 45, 50 minutes, I want to present, so please hold off with your question. At about 3:15, I think I'm trying to finish. Maybe you can help me with that. So we have really half an hour for questions of yours. I try to answer them as best as I can for some discussion, right? So please hold your questions, and then we'll get to them. Okay? Good. So first off, Professor Benito told you about me a little bit, but I want to also tell you a little bit of my own story, a little bit editorialized, right? Because when you hear probably, oh, professor in Miami, you're thinking like, wow, nice, I want to go to Miami, yada, 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 right? It's seen as, of course, a tropical paradise, but the reality, if you live there, is very different, okay? So that's why I titled sort of this bio page, From the American Dream to sort of the semi-nightmare, okay? I'm actually German-born from Bavaria, near Munich, and then after I got my diploma in Munich, I got the so-called Fulbright Exchange Scholarship. I don't know any Fulbright here? No? Okay, check it out to the extent that it is still funded by the US government, which many things are not these days. It's a wonderful exchange program, right? It really, literally, obviously changed my life because I spent 1 year in the United States getting my master's. Then came back to Munich, worked at the University of Munich in the international office, responsible for the Erasmus program, which you probably all are very familiar with, right? And so my interest was deep, of course, in international relations. Wanting to have a specialization in European studies in the US, I went over there to do my doctorate at the so-called University of Miami. So I am from Florida International University, which is Miami's public research university, right? The University of Miami is Miami's private university. I did my PhD there, and we shared the EU Center that I now direct, the Germany Center, already at the time. So I worked as a graduate assistant since 2002 at the EU Center. Now that means I have been 20 years in the US. By now I also am a US citizen, so I have double citizenship, right? Because, when you're over there for a very long time, you want to become integrated, right? And but now I feel almost like I want to come back to Europe as soon as possible because of the pressures of the Trump administration. As a public university, a state university, I experience a lot of what we call politicization of higher education, right? Meaning sort of that the professoriate, academic freedom to teach whatever you want to teach, all of these have come under tremendous pressure. Literally, our state's governor has called us leftist indoctrinators, okay? And that's just sort of, aside from insult, it's also factually untrue. So what we experience at a state university is a lot of repression of higher education. And that located in Miami. I don't know, have you been in Miami, anyone? A few? Okay, yeah. You decide yourself if you want to go or not. Again, it looks great, but it is increasingly Republican, right? If you want to hear more about it, maybe later. And it is also crisis-ridden. There's a crisis of cost of living and affordability, right? In terms of people being able to pay their rents. We're only slightly cheaper than Manhattan at this point, one of the most expensive rental markets in the United States. It's also ecologically in crisis. Miami is one of the top 5 cities affected by climate change. Yet, guess what? They keep on building more and more and more skyscrapers, right? So there's a number of issues in Miami that I just want to mention this because you probably sometimes we have a superficial idea of what Miami represents. And, as Professor Benito pointed out, Florida, Miami's in Florida. Florida is one of the most conservative, Republican-governed states in the United States. So we have to deal not only with the policies coming from Washington under the Trump administration, but also with the policies coming from our governor, Ron DeSantis, who, if you remember, wanted to run against Donald Trump by literally out-Trumping Trump in terms of the harshness of policies. Okay? So that is just a little bit of background. I published, of course, on transatlantic relations, a couple of pieces, and in general, you talked about EU political sociology. But now let's get to the topic. Transatlantic relations in the shadow, the impact of the Trump administration. First of all, I want to highlight that, of course, if you think about transatlantic EU-US relations, there are two different aspects to consider, right? One is sort of the question of leadership on both sides of the Atlantic, and the other one here, personified or like sort of illustrated by sort of a cartoon of Trump's depiction of Europe. You can check out yourself where your country and what it falls under. Right? Italy, the perfect democracy, right? Mm-hmm. Germans, dodgy car dealers, and I don't even want to go to the shithole countries here, right? That affect it. But so these are what I'm trying to tell you here is that, of course, transatlantic relations have ebbed and flow in the quality of cooperation a lot with the leadership in power. Right? As you probably know, democratically governed administration in the US usually were more receptive to European cooperation, right? They were also more welcomed than Republican ones. And there's some data that I can show you later about the public opinion. But aside from that, it's important to think also about structural issues. These are the larger systemic issues that we see in the international system. And here I want to highlight two varieties. And one is nicely expressed with this Time magazine cover. Guess from where? Can you read from when it is? 1973, okay? And what does it say? Europe, America's new rival. Okay? So the idea that Europe could become a rival to the US has been already quite old. Okay? So one thing that this expresses is the idea that the United States does not necessarily consider the European Union, in particular, as an institutional ally, but rather as a competitor. And obviously now in the Trump era, right, is actually actively fighting the European Union institutions. Right? So this is one point of the structural issue. The other point of the structural issue is sort of the geopolitical moment that we live in. And you all are familiar with it, right? The rise of authoritarianism among powerful nations and how they also work together. And thereby, the liberal international order that we have known throughout most of the 20th century is eroding. Some say it's dead at this point. Whereas, of course, the geopolitical, power-laden, fragmented global system is where we're moving to. Or we are already living in, depending on your view of things. A little bit of context and some questions that I want to at least raise for you to think about, and I hope we can answer. Here is almost an op-ed article from David Pressman, the U.S. former Biden U.S. ambassador to Hungary, right? Who basically said, it happened in Hungary, now it's happening here. That's pretty much how I see it too, as somebody living in Florida. A think tank report about the United States trumping the EU after the last trade negotiations. Right? And returning back to the idea of global authoritarianism and the transnational connections between those. Anne Applebaum, I don't know if you had a chance to read her book, Autocracy, Inc., right? Which is a great read about dictators, authoritarians, connecting transnationally with each other to create a new geopolitical order rather than the liberal international order. Okay, So one of the questions that you must have all asked yourself, last year I was here I was speaking the day after the elections, remember? That was quite the experience. Is how did a convicted billionaire, outsider, get elected again? Right? I'm sure many of you have asked yourself this. Do you have any answers to that? What would you suggest? It's okay if you want. Yes, please.
He sort of embodies the American dream. He's the person who rose to wealth, to upstart amount of wealth, and he represents sort of a way that America is perceived in the outside world, but also I think among the Americans themselves.
Yeah, that's certainly part of the explanation, right? Exactly. And what you describe is sort of this Wall Street, wolf eats wolf type of capitalism, right? So greedy, no questions asked, exactly. For many that represents success, in the US there is a much less regulated neoliberal structure than in Europe, right? And that certainly contributes to it, absolutely. Any other ideas why you might have got?
Disappointment with the previous administration, especially when it comes to economics and financial issues. So they went for the other viable option, let's say.
Right. Plus, remember, it was an option that they thought was a known option already because they governed from 2016 to 2020, right? So certainly the Biden administration, while they tried their best, they had to deal with a lot of challenges, the pandemic, not least the pandemic, right? There was a lot of talk about Kamala Harris, remember, the Democratic contender, not being the best candidate, although there were not many candidates to deal with, and they had to first get Joe Biden himself to not run another again, right? So yes, there was a little bit of frustration about the Democrats. But there was also, in general, let's go back to what you said in the beginning, a general expectation that economically the United States, right, for many ordinary citizens, the life has to get better. These bread and butter issues that resulted in what we could probably call a protest vote. You all know this in many of your countries, right? Governments have come to power because of protest votes. And you see this still today. If you heard the discussions that are going on right now, I almost didn't make it here. I was telling Columbia because of the government shutdown and the cancellation of flights, right? Because the flight controllers were not being paid for a month by the government, right? So the government shutdown lasted so long. Why? Because the Democrats were insisting on extending Medicare subsidies to create affordable health care. Can you imagine this? And what happened now? A couple moderate, 7 or 8 moderate Democrats gave in to end the shutdown, but therefore making it very likely that next year the health insurance contributions for millions of citizens will rise dramatically, hundreds of dollars each month, not each year. Okay? So these are cost of living issues, bread and butter issues, right, that may have resulted in that. Well, another question for you. Do you think this time Trump administration is different from 2016, right, his first time? And that the US will become, in the medium run, let's say 5 to 15 years, semi-authoritarian? What's your idea about that? Can I just maybe by a show of hands, do you think that this time the Trump administration is different than the previous one? Please raise your hand if you think so. Okay, maybe about half, right? Okay, and then do you think that the US will become semi-authoritarian in 5 to 15 years? Please raise your hand. Wow, only a few. Wow, you guys are really optimists. It's good to have you, right, the young generation being so optimistic. I'm not quite as optimistic, to be very honest. The damage to the institutions protecting democracy has been so large, as you'll hear in a second, that it may well become sort of like Hungary, a case where it's very, very hard. Poland has seen its own issues, as you know. where it's very, very hard. It will take years, if not decades, to recover from the damage that is being done right now. Why, you may ask? Why I'm saying this? Well, the first 4 years of Trump, 2016 to 2020, if you remember, those were chaotic 4 years, right? Trump had no administrative backbone. And so a lot of the policies that he thought, as an outside businessman, he could implement in a very monarchical, absolutist style, were of course blocked by these institutions themselves, by career diplomats in the State Department, right? By, the administration. So, when Biden was in power, 2020 to 2024, the Trump administration's secret inside club devised a plan together with the so-called Heritage Foundation, which you may have heard, right? The so-called Project 2025. A blueprint for how to create a different government in the US. Sounds outrageous, but guess what is happening right now? Exactly those people that wrote Project 2025 are in positions of power and are implementing textbook-wise exactly what is in there. Well, to the extent that courts or other, diplomats are not stopping them. So this time will be different, and I fear for the democratic quality of the United States very much. And that doesn't mean only the US, guys. As you know, what happens in the US affects the rest of the world. Well, as an extension of that, do you think the liberal international era is over? You know what I mean by liberal, I think, right? We all know, right? The post-World War II, 1945, created U.S. left, if you want to say, what do you think? Please raise your hand if you think that era is over. Yeah, I see one hand already going up.
I think it's a crisis because still in trade, international trade, we see signs of resistance, but thinking about political and democracy, probably it is dying.
Yeah, exactly. Like the trend, I think there were a couple of other folks raising their hands. So still a minority, but I wish I was more optimistic than the majority of you. But I would very much say that exactly the old order that may not have been all that great because it was just basically a US-dominated neoliberal mess that got us into the ecological and human rights mess that we experience these days, is kind of eroding, and we're getting into a much more dangerous, geopolitical, fragmented, multipolar world. And, of course, this is what the lecture is really about, the presentation. What does all of this then portend for the EU's dependence on the United States, which you know has been quite large throughout the 20th century. First, I'm going to give you a quick rerun about what happened since Trump took office, okay? At the end of last year, beginning of this year. First, domestic and foreign policy, which is more interesting for us. Then I want to talk about sort of the narratives of transatlantic relations, and towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you some ideas of what I think probably would be good in how the EU could respond to the relentless pressure that's coming from the other side. So, I'm going to keep this sort of short, guys, but again, give you the big picture, because these are domestic factors. So what happened? So much happened. Right? We were talking about it yesterday, but I'm highlighting here a couple points in that. The ending of effective checks and balances. And checks and balances are needed in every democracy, right? That you have institutions that check each other. Executive, judiciary, legislature, you know this. That's even more important in a non-parliamentary system, meaning a presidential system, like the US, where exactly it's happening what should not be happening. The concentration of power in the executive's hands. MAGA, Make America Great Again, you know about this, right? MAGA, there's a MAGA-controlled Congress, the Speaker of the House is also a major MAGA representative. And in addition to the Congress, we cannot rely on that anymore to stop the president's overreach on power. And then you wonder, okay, what's left? The courts, right? It's the usual quick answer. The courts have to contest. The courts will contest, just like they did in Poland, just like they've tried, in other countries that where the democracy was under fire. Well, what do you think? The Supreme Court of the United States, is it really an opposition or not? I want to hear from yes, please.
Yeah, no, because actually now conservatives have the majority, there are 6 conservatives and 3, let's say...
liberals. We call them liberals, progressive, which means progressive, right?
In most cases we see that they follow Trump's direction.
Exactly.
The abortion,
exactly, yes please. Do you want to add to that? Yes please. Do you want to add?
Yes, I agree with Prof in this case. And I want to say that yesterday Trump endorsed Giuliani and
oh yeah.
so that is something that can do the executive power. So I don't know what happened with the justice.
Exactly. I'm asking myself that too, and Americans as well. The approval of the Supreme Court, which was seen as the most independent, politically independent, and most valued political institution, has gone drastically down because, with there are 9 Supreme Court justices, 6 are conservative, 3 are progressives. Out of these 6 conservatives, 3 were named by Trump already. So you can see here, they have been in agreement with Trump's cases that Trump brought up. About 65, depending on from when you count, 65 to 80% of the time. Okay? That means the Supreme Court is not an effective veto player to safeguard U.S. democracy anymore. Then you have, of course, the lower courts. These are the usually federal circuit courts, okay? They are, of course, more often than not against Trump policies, okay? Oftentimes because they are also in democratically controlled states, which there are 50 of in the United States. But of course, when the cases go up to the Supreme Court has the last say and can invalidate them all, okay? Why that is so, we can maybe debate later. Also, to let you know, there are over 200 cases pending. This means the Trump administration has the most cases, the most litigious, contentious judicial system we've seen in the recent history in the United States. All of this doesn't speak well for the courts, right? The judiciary as a bulwark to defend democracy. Well, media. Okay, this just here talks about private media, guys. Public media has largely been defunded already. I don't know if you heard about it. PBS, right? The public had to shut down, literally. And a lot of public media is dying as well. And you know yourself how important public media are. They may not be trendy as fashionable as TikTok or Instagram or whatever, but public media is usually very much cherished for its independence of coverage. Now, with private media, what happens is a lot of these kind of bends to the wishes of Trump, right? And so they're kind of opportunistic to avoid the pressure. They've taken out all their DEI, meaning diversity, equity, inclusion information and programs at corporations, right? They put in new CEOs that are conservative leaning. CBS is a case in point, okay? And the same with big tech companies. Amazon, Google, Meta, right? All these platforms have pretty much given in. You may remember that infamous photo when they were sitting at the inauguration of Trump, right? Just kind of applauding to, hoping for more tax breaks or whatever. Again, the media, an important control instrument, has been leveled in the United States. Higher education. Literally, the Department of Education is being dismantled at this point. That means it cannot be totally eradicated because it would take Congress to do that. But and there are some essential functions that the Department of Education needs to do, right? Like, guarantee the legality of certain public educational policies. But it has been heavily dismantled, being made less powerful. And J.D. Vance, the current US Vice President, has literally said universities are the enemy. Okay, that was before he became Vice President. But that is, I think, a good slogan to kind of tell you how they consider places like this here. And of course, my university in Miami as well. Well, in terms of human rights, right? Another important aspect for democracy, you would think, rule of law and human rights, right? You probably have heard all of this, right? Sending thousands, tens of thousands of undocumented citizens. That doesn't mean illegal citizens. I think you're all aware of this, right? Our university itself has 500 undocumented students who came as kids to Miami. You know, they're American and everything, that they don't, except that they don't have, you know, the papers, the citizenship. They don't want to come on campus anymore for fear of being deported. Okay? People are being sent into jails. They're being sent abroad into Honduran jails, right? Which, you know, you cannot guarantee human rights there at all. And even refugee children are sent abroad. And of course, in the last piece here domestically that I wanted to highlight is sending literally military guard and National Guard into cities such as Chicago, Portland, San Francisco, Washington D.C. itself, right? To basically combat the enemy within. And by the way, that's an important key term that reappears in Project 2025. Okay, so the enemy within are basically the Democrats themselves, and you know, any sort of progressive liberal movement, right? Black Lives Matter movement, you know, the Palestinian right protest movements right now. These are the enemy within that needs to be combated. And that's just a reversal of, you know, rule of law that is, you would think unthinkable, but it actually happens. To keep it short, it means the concentrating, right, of executive power in a semi-authoritarian manner. Now let's look at the domestic side. The foreign policy side, because that's really more related to IR. The Trump administration has drastically cut foreign aid. You've probably heard about this, right? Depending on which measure you take, between 20 and 25% of overall aid. Given that the US was the single biggest national supplier of foreign aid in the world, even a quarter means, you know, billions in aid and hundreds of thousands of children, right? HIV and other chronic disease folks that are dying in the next 4 years of his term. You probably know all of this already, right? So I keep it short. He withdrew from pretty much every international treaty, multilateral treaty that you can think of, be it most of the UN institutions, the World Health Organization, UNESCO, the Paris Treaty to combat climate change, Belen, right? There was no US delegation there. The World Trade Organization, he basically funked that as well, which is important for the international trading system, and the dispute settlement panel that arbitrates on major trade policies. Well, fun thing, right? Yeah, threatening to take over Greenland, the Panama Canal, right? So may possibly invading Venezuela. Right? That's like the backyard of the US anyway. We can talk about this maybe later if you want. Okay, but the Greenland issue, as you know, is very serious. It's not only Denmark, right, but it's also the whole European Union, which kind of feels certain. And the issue is not over yet. What's basically going on right now, this is a little bit more sort of my thinking than sustained facts, okay? There's sort of CIA operations to kind of eventually in a couple of years lead to a referendum on Greenland's independence from Denmark anyway, right? So it's just something unthinkable and incompatible with international law. Of course, it also means, hello, Argentina, right? Supporting like-minded governments. You have probably heard about this sort of deal that he cut with Javier Milei, right? Argentina's right-wing president and buddy, to supply 20 billion, right? If he gets re-elected, which he did. You would know more about the background of this. Hungary, Orban, he was just, right? Orban was just in DC to get basically also a deal cut, a friendly deal. And then maybe he's in talks to get more funding from the US administration based on the Argentinian model, whereby in order for Orban to make up funds that the European Union actually cut because of the problems with rule of law. So, direct interventionism in friendly countries supporting Trump, while of course pressuring other countries into compliance. European Union, the trade deal, right? Pressuring to finance more for NATO, do more for NATO, basically taking on the Ukraine case, right? Which the Americans or the Trump administration does not really want to support. Threatening to take over Canada, by the way, right? Punitive tariff from Mexico, Brazil, right? Literal political intervention saying you have to release Bolsonaro, the former president, or you're going to be hit with these 50% extra tariffs. You see here. It's a very transactional wolf-eat-wolf diplomacy. Actually, it's called, some experts call it the pariah diplomacy. They even renamed the Defense Department in the US the War Department, right? Basically highlighting the offensive moves, not only regarding, for example, Venezuela, which of course upsets the whole Caribbean, but also the heritage projects. Project 2025 literally calls China the enemy number one. So for our Chinese friend, right, just read that section, which you can find online, about the foreign policy and China being the enemy number one. Tariffs, I'm sure you have heard about these, right? But these unilateral deals, and unilateral means basically they're imposed, they're not negotiated, okay? Are causing a lot of friction, not only brings opposition. And then there's the tackle. Do you know what tackle means? Kind of like, don't worry. So Trump basically, for a while, he was just handing out tariff rates with little justification. They were quite high. Remember, in a globalized trading system, our tariffs in WTO are usually fairly low, right? 10% or less. And here now we're talking, he imposed first, he wanted to impose 30% tariff on most EU products, which after the meeting in July with von der Leyen, the Commission President, went down for 15% tariffs, which is still quite high for most products. There are some exempted products, right? But 15% is quite high. But because he reduced it, and because there was a lot of protest from economists as well about the way he handles economic policy, they kind of tackle, which means Trump always chickens out. Okay? I hope there will be more tackle to be seen, right? Because of course in his bombastic stage stature and not knowing much about trade policy, he just kind of tries to proclaim a certain tariff without much justification, and then has to see like, maybe we need that country's product, right? Soybeans or otherwise. And of course, going back to the authoritarian age, you all know he allies with other authoritarians, be it Viktor Orban in Hungary, Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, President Erdogan, right, in Turkey, and even Putin, right? There's certain, weak support for the Ukraine, and only recently, when the European Union imposed the 19th package of sanctions against Russia, he did a more powerful step of imposing sanctions, for example, on Gazprom and Rosneft, right? The biggest oil and gas companies in Russia. Private enrichment, something that's also unheard of through his public office and his family. There are certain Trump family deals in Albania, right, in the Middle East. His own Trump properties in DC that are being used to curry favor with the international clientele visiting DC. In the end, that means the end of the liberal international order and the creation of global instability, which is already pretty unstable. The basis of it, the Hungary modeled Project 2025. From the Heritage Foundation, a plan to reduce the federal government and replace it with sort of a monarchical type, absolutist government. And, of course, we should not forget a religious nationalist rule, right? The rising power of Christian nationalists in the US, and there are a lot of in the administration key positions as well. Okay, but this is not just my listing. So here I want to give you also a little bit of empirical data. ProjectDemocracy.org, a think tank in the US, has actually comparatively, assessed the quality of democracy, and this data is should be from 2025. And you can see here, out of 5, where 5 means you're basically an authoritarian system, and 1 you're being a good democracy, right? The US is at a dangerous, severe threat of 3.3. You have the different sections here: treatment of media, 3.2, executive constraints, hardly any, checks and balances, there are none, so 3.8, quite severe threat. Elections, significant threat. Civil liberties, a severe threat. Civil violence, not yet, right? But we are slowly ratcheting up to civil war-like tensions within the US, 2.5 out of 5, and the rhetoric, 4 out of 5. You can also see here the comparators, right? Poland, 2.3, United Kingdom, 1.8, Germany, 1.5, so rather low in comparison. Okay, now let's switch gears a little bit. I want to tell you now a little bit about sort of the classic transatlantic narrative that's being proclaimed, particularly by the European Union as well, right? In regards to the transatlantic relationship. Guys, here there's a little bit of data. I don't know if you can see it, but I'm sure they can send the PowerPoint around. Basically, 50 million jobs depend on both sides of the Atlantic on transatlantic relations. Approximately 4 trillion collective EU-US stocks. That means the EU and the US have the largest economic and finance relationships in the world, not the US and China, right? It's the EU and the US, which is why that relationship is so important. And then, of course, you have the classic points that you may have heard, particularly from EU diplomats. I mean, this is factual. The world's most important trade relationship with regards to foreign direct investment, mutual investment in the other countries, other continent, with trade and jobs. Let me get here, to this one. I'm going to highlight this here, right? And a lot of the justifications for the trade deal, the trade tariff that Trump made with von der Leyen in July, is based on the fact that he said, well, the Europeans, basically, they're not importing enough of our stuff, okay? He may be right, but he's also wrong. Because if you look at that Eurostats data, you see here, I underlined 2 important data points that you want to remember, okay? Of course, yes, you can see that the EU export of goods to the US is quite high. 533 billion in 2024. Whereas the EU imports of goods, the lower right is only 330. Yes, there is a 150 billion trade deficit, okay, or trade surplus that the Europeans have with the US. But with regards to services, all the online media services that you use and all the other services, the US has a trade surplus with the Europeans, so it is not as imbalanced as the Trump administration will tell us. And this is mentioned here. The EU import of services from the US is 483 billion, whereas the EU export of services is only 330, right? So the EU has a trade surplus, the US has a services surplus. In many ways, you could say they balance themselves out. My point being, it's not as unbalanced as the Trump administration says. Transatlantic dialogue, kind of bureaucratic, so I keep this short. There's, of course, on the highest executive levels, regular meetings. The legislature, also between Congress and the European Parliament, they meet every 6 months. And you have specific experts, and that's here, the TTC. That's called the Trade and Technology Council. I don't know if you heard about that. The Biden administration came up because they saw the issues emerging with the European tech regulation. And so the Biden administration wisely said, well, we should probably meet to hash out differences in opinion. So that happened during the Biden administration every 6 months. Since Trump took office, there was not one single Trade Technology Council meeting. Over. Well, we're global partners. You give us over and over again, right? But this global partners really sort of is an artificial Cold War relationship, as I say here on the title. Okay? And of course, NATO was always a 900-pound gorilla that kept the Americans in European defense, but also made it impossible for the Europeans to develop their own defense capabilities to the extent necessary, which the Russian invasion of Ukraine has shown us. Multilateralism is the same. As you know, the EU is a multilateral body by nature, right? That's why they're supporting the UN as well. The US, since 1973, if you remember the time picture, has not understood how to deal with multilateral partners and have preferred bilateral relationships. Shared values, well, I'm not sure we can say there is much, right? That there is, on both sides of the Atlantic, sort of the alliance to democracy anymore given. Acknowledging that we have our own issues with democratic quality in Europe, in most European countries, right? You know this. Human rights, well, if ICE is hunting down people in cities, right, you can't really talk about human rights being guarded anymore, or, you know, transgender people being, persecuted through all means and so on and so on. Inequality, well, I'd like to think we still have sort of rudimentary social welfare systems here. Again, just think of my example that I gave you about healthcare costs for Americans, which make living unaffordable. Just a little bit to say that, of course, in public opinion, the US's view of the EU varies also by role. The elites usually tend to have a more knowledge and therefore a more positive view on the Europeans. However, what we've seen over the last years has been a polarization of opinions, whereby Republicans increasingly think negatively about Europeans, and Democrats still, of course, keep that line, right? We are democracies, we need to work together transatlantic. I went over this already. This is just some data, but I think you're all familiar, right? With sort of the NATO push that now instead of the 2% of expenditures, of national expenditures on defense, right? The Trump administration has pushed successfully for between 3.5 and 5% of national expenditures that need to be happening on defense. And we're still far away from even 3.5%, as you can see here. This is 2025 spending. Okay, what are some of the explanatory factors for divergence? Guys, and here, I just want to, before I get to those factors, I want to show you here, this up and down is basically, right, goes back to the public opinion on US presidents in Europe. And you can see here, the Bush administration, right, went quite down. Obama was, of course, the rock star, celebrated in many European capitals, right, with his own issues. Trump down significantly to lower than 20%. The Biden administration a little bit more critical, and now, of course, Germany 18. I don't know, Italy wasn't measured here, right? Germany 18, and just the UK, of course, as sort of a fellow Anglo nation, 37%. Okay, what are some of the factors for the increasing divergence? Structural factors for the divergence. One is the question of geopolitics, we have to come back to that, and the multipolarity, okay? So, for the EU, again, is not only seen as a multilateral problem for the United States, okay? But think about it. The bigger question is, if the US, our traditional partner from the West, is not that anymore, is unreliable, and we have to go it our own, and the major conflict, which we'll see in the 21st century, will be about the US fighting with China as enemy number one. What will happen to the EU? Will the EU be the loser in a so-called G2 system? Right now, we're desperately, meaning the EU institutions on the line and so on, try desperately to become still, to appeal to the United States so that they may not be losing out in the larger, to create also more Western leverage over China, because we have, in a way, similar problems with regards to dependency on Chinese markets, dependency on Chinese raw material, microchips, yada, yada, yada. One thing that is difficult to tell is that the US now has what we call neo-isolationism. The US has always, throughout its history, modern history, oscillated between unilateral impulses, like we are the world police, we go in our own way, we don't need the Europeans, and of course the other extreme. We want to be the world police, heavily liberal, internationalist interference, right? Which of course for the Europeans is also hard to project. Like, where are we standing? Where is the US right now? We have to, every 4 years, we have to kind of, right? And we're getting tired of this constant like reorientation of our foreign policies on the US's prevailing foreign policy preference at the moment. And another one, if you think about it, is a distinction where the US usually sees countries as a threat. Iran is next to China, enemy number 2, for example, right? Hamas maybe another one, I know. In the EU, we see threats more issue-based. The environment, global instability, right? During the pandemic, it was global health, and so on and so on. So we have different threat perceptions as well. No? Despite that, we have what I call a competitive leadership. You can see this very clearly in terms of economics. I just showed you, we balance each other out in terms of the surpluses. Right? The US has a slightly larger global GDP output, but really that depends on the year and the sector of the economy. But right now, there's more imbalance created by the fact that most of the big tech companies that you all use on your phones and computers, they're US-based. And as you know, we cannot compete with them. More theoretically, the US has the religious national exceptionalism. The shining city on a hill is a very important sort of quote. Whereas the EU has a secular, non-religious, and pacific exceptionalism that abhors the idea of wars. And that question about the defense, the rearmament of Europe, is something that probably is going to be much more contested as it already is in Europe. Different norms. We talked about much of it, but for example, as I said, the US is basically the only Western advanced economy that has no paid vacation days, right? Imagine that. So the welfare system, healthcare is heavily embedded right now, unaffordable for many. The US also has the death penalty, together with Japan as one of the few outliers in the global north or Western world. Populism is actually something that we both have, right? So that's potentially, you could say, an alliance. And interestingly, if you look at it, you see a very increased collaboration of US far-right politicians with European far-right politicians. Because, of course, European far-right politicians cannot count on Russia and Putin anymore after 2022. And, of course, the other opposing pair is our understanding of a multilateral system in which many European politicians would like to have the liberal international order back, which is not going to come back very soon, and the America First policy, right, of the Trump administration. The institutionalization of collaboration, well, TTIP, that was the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, if you remember. That was proposed actually under the Obama administration, but Obama didn't get it done. And then, of course, Trump came and put it on ice, or declared it dead. Trade and Technology Council, again, was there to negotiate over differences in tech regulation, the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, and so on and so on. It's also dead right now. Climate policy, right? You know what's going on right now with the US pulling out of Paris and so on. Post-Paris negotiations. China, there is some convergence in the perception of China as a threat, but you may also remember, right, that even the Biden administration drove a much harder course than the Europeans wanted to. Biden called it the decoupling from China. Right? Trump initially did that too, but Trump now sees, and his advisor, that we are more reliant on Chinese raw materials than we want, so we need to play nice for now. we always we wanted to have a more independent course, but a lot in the future will depend on to what extent I think the Europeans can, rather than decouple, can what van der Leyen called de-risking, right? Exposing the Europeans to less risk in the relationship with China. So, overall, this EU is more process-oriented, believes in old-school negotiations, whereas the US has always had a penchant for unilateral, quick, fixed action. It's a different also in diplomatic style. One point, guys, and I'm slowly coming to an end, is the important factor. We always think about, okay, the EU on one side, right, and the US on another side. Ritterfold and Newsom came out actually with a third aspect that's important. And the third criteria that influences the quality of transatlantic relationships is the way in which, how well the EU is functioning within. And so here I underline the weakened EU-US relations that we find ourselves in, right? And so they came up with this model. You can either have a unified EU, right? If the EU was just unified, they call it an emerging EU superpower. Well, it's a little bit idealistic if you ask me, right? Or a fragmented EU, which I think is much closer to where we find ourselves in right now, right? And that means an unraveling of EU-US relations, because there is no counterpart for the US, and in fact there are 27 different opinions about transatlantic relations, rather than one single channel through Brussels. Does that make sense? So think about this. This is very important. You also have to consider the degree of unity within the EU, rather than just the transatlantic pair. And now to kind of conclude, exactly, for Vades EU, where are we going, right, in the future? Of course, I don't have a crystal ball, so these are just sort of informed opinions of mine, and we can debate that with you. And what I suggest is that in the next decade, we will have to the EU has to walk a fine balancing act, right? Between cooperating with the US where necessary and competing and establishing independence from the US where possible. Does it make sense? And that is a fine balancing act, and we will make mistakes. That means that strategically, right now, making certain concessions to appease Trump to gain time, because the Europeans need time. To build up European defense industries, you cannot do that within a year, right? We're already in multi-year contractual programs that keep us dependent on the US for the next decade or so. So we need to buy time to achieve a lot of autonomy. Or you can just try like Spain, but Spain may get the repercussions for that, or China, or Brazil, or India, say like they're resisting the pressure from the Trump administration. Spain resisting the pressure, right, to pay more than 2% for NATO for defense expenditures. China resisting, and India getting oil from Russia. Brazil resisting releasing Bolsonaro because Trump wants his body released. So buying time is going to be important. With regards to Ukrainian security, well, we can debate this, guys. We have to, of course, expand our defense capabilities. That will mean a difficult balancing act. Because where are we going to take the money from right now in particular? Expanding defense capabilities independently from the US means potential market building in Europe and basically creating new economic sectors that we need, because as you know, most of our economies, except for Poland and Spain, are not doing so well. On the other hand, this means that you've probably heard about these discussions in your countries, cutbacks to cherish social welfare measures. Right? So it's butter versus defense. And here we need to balance, of course, also the commitment that's already been made to continue to purchase US purchases, not only of military equipment, but also gas and oil, liquefied natural gas, in the hundreds of billions. That von der Leyen in July committed to 750 billion of it. Okay? The building up of our own markets, and of course, the big 900-pound gorilla, the question about can we make use of Russian assets held in Belgium right now. Right? I'll probably talk about this already. Because that would help a lot. With regards to trade and economy, again, I'm not a political economist, but economists have floated a number of ideas. Well, you may have all heard about the Draghi, right? Mario Draghi's report from a year ago, the competitiveness report, in which he said we are lagging in productivity and in innovation, and we need to invest in the EU hundreds of billions more. And of course, when von der Leyen, the Commission President, came up with like a big declaration, we're going to co-finance with the member states, a couple hundred billions. We'll see if this materializes. A year later, so far not much has happened except for that defense push. That means increase also the spending on research and development, on university research, right? Another point that is less costly, which is also supported by many member states, is reducing the number of EU regulations. That's good. If you've ever worked on a European Union grant like we, you are in favor for reducing EU regulation, believe me, reducing the paperwork and the hurdles you have to jump through. But it also entails, right, lowering environmental standards, lowering labor standards, and also digital privacy rights, yada standards, right? And the Trump administration is very much zooming in on environmental and the reduction of environmental and digital standards, of course, to support their big tech. The EU has not made use of the so-called anti-coercion sanctions. I don't know if you heard about this, but the anti-coercion instrument was created by the European Union in 2023 as a result of the previous Trump hiccups, and basically allowed for the European Union to impose, similar in the WTO style, countervailing sanctions on countries like the US who would pressure us into unilateral deals. However, in July, when von der Leyen and Trump went to Scotland, right, to hash out that, or agree to that deal, they didn't negotiate really, von der Leyen did nothing of that sort. Why? Because for now, the EU institutions want to avoid an outright trade war, particularly given sort of the precarious state of our national economies in the European Union. But it is basically the so-called trade bazooka, right, that could be used, and some have argued for using it, even if it means inciting a transatlantic trade war, which would be costly for all of us. What we have done, however, is the last point, diversified trade globally, right? We're still the number one trading relationship with the US in economic and financial terms, but we have now diversified our trade. We have the EU-Mercosur agreement with the Mercosur countries of Latin America, right? We just passed the EU-Indonesia agreement, Mexico, right? We have another 5 or 10 in the line, including with India, which is a big one. So there you can see the EU actually jumping into action, reliance on other partners. With regards to the EU's role internationally, guys, this sounds all pretty drastic, what I told you. But some analysts have actually said that it also presents an opportunity for us, because we were held artificially, right, as sort of the junior partner from the US for such a long time. And if it was up to Trump, we would still be there in the future. So technically, this pressure allows us to take a more independent course, particularly now where the G8 has become the G20 group of nations, right? Where the global south is rising in power. So we have, again, the balancing act, collaborating with the traditional partner, if you want to say, the US, while establishing a more independent course with global south nations, with the rest. Internally, that also means, again, balancing cooperation with the US where necessary. Why firewalling the EU's internal far-right parties, which are clamoring for power now that they've seen what happened in the US and they think they can do it here as well? I mean, for our Italian friends here, you kind of know already, although I would say Meloni is not the Trumpian, right? She is maybe cherished by Trump, but mostly because of her looks. But, she falls still, if you ask me, into sort of the center-right, between center-right and far-right category. Okay, but there are many far-right parties, everyone from Le Pen to the AfD in Germany and so on, who, like Fox in Spain, who we just love to follow. And we need to expose their boomerang collaboration with the US. Because that's happening right now too. A lot of these far-right partners, they are being hosted, US partners from the MAGA executives are hosted in Hungary for Europe-wide conferences. And European far-right politicians are regularly, more often than ever, going to Washington, D.C. to badmouth the state of democracy in Europe. There are actually European politicians and intellectuals, if you want to call them, who are claiming asylum in the U.S. right now, okay? And basically using the Trump pressure to create, and you've heard this probably before, more strategic autonomy for the European Union. Okay? And not only in defense, also economically, digitally as well. That means more R&D, building up our own tech companies. And maybe we should do the same what the far right is doing in the US. Elon Musk, right? Chiming in and trying to influence European elections. Maybe we should, the progressive West, support the democratic forces. If you follow the US a little bit, you heard about the November 4th elections that just happened. In every election, the Democrats won. Next year, we have the so-called congressional midterm elections in 2026. Okay? If this goes on, the Democrats have a good chance to win again, strongly in the 2026 next year elections, which put them potentially on a successful course for 2028. If electoral integrity is still existing there, which we don't know, right? So with that, I'll leave it off. Thank you for attention, and I'll welcome you.
Okay, as usual, Professor Thiel is open to your questions and comments. And let's start. Yes, from here. Thank you very much. So I don't have to run. Yes, please introduce yourself as usual.
Hello, I'm Markus, I'm a student here of European Studies. And I would like to know whether you think that it's likely that the US Supreme Court will rule against the tariffs and what impacts there will be on the transatlantic relations.
Mm-hmm, yeah. So the question...
Collect or...
Oh, okay, yeah.
As you like.
Can I do one by one? Because I don't have something to write and I will forget about it. 3 or 4 questions. Thank you. Yeah, so the question was, remember, about the US tariffs, right? Let me just sit down for a second. So, of course, I don't know how they're going to rule it, but that case has gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court usually takes, between 12 to 24 months to deliberate, right? So the hearings were there. Again, the fact, it doesn't look good in the sense that the Supreme Court sides more often than not with the Trump administration, right? But we don't really know if that's what's going to happen. So what was your second part?
If that happens,
yeah.
The consequences that will be on the transatlantic relations.
Oh yeah,
You're
of course.
You're ready for God.
See, I can't even think. So, what will be the impact if the Supreme Court sides with basically the rest of the world, right, against the Trump administration, which is unlikely, if you ask me. But of course, that would reopen, negotiations from the rest of the world. However, the problem is that technically, according to WTO rules, we could then impose countervailing sanctions, right? Because then US tariffs would be considered illegal. But the WTO itself is not functioning right now as it should. So, in the end, the dominant position of the US in the global economy, I think, will not change as much as it may change should there be a negative Supreme Court outcome, which is unlikely. I don't have a crystal ball, right? Thanks.
Okay, next one. Yes.
Yeah, there were two. Oh, three. Yeah. Oh,
Hi. I'm Thiel. I'm from Greece. I'm from the L3 Master's Program. And I wanted to ask you about more internal US politics and how it would also affect the relations with the EU.
Right.
Because as you mentioned your last point about the most recent elections of last week, we saw a very big win for the Democratic Party, and especially with electing Mamdani as the New York mayor, who had very strong opinions, very strong stances, and we saw all of that appealing a lot, especially to a younger audience who really craved that change and having stronger opinions on certain issues, which we didn't see with previous Democratic candidates. If you think that that will inspire maybe the Democratic candidate for the next presidential elections, or if you see, because at the same time we see the rise of far-right sentiments in the younger generations as well, especially conservatism and Christian values, etc. If you think that there will be a certain change or not in the coming elections, and if that will affect the relation with the EU.
Thank you. Good question. May I tell really quick friends, right? I think, I'm not sure if Aristotle said that, but it's sad that Aristotle said, what is it, a swallow does not yet make a summer. Is that correct? So, I mean, that's what I read. Anyway, so if Aristotle was right, and he said this, right, my first thought when you said this about Mamdani winning as mayor of New York as a democratic socialist, right, which is socialist is sold anyway in the US, is a swallow does not yet make a summer, okay? A single win in a city as exceptional as US, just like, Paris is not France, right, for our French friends, Rome is not Italy for our Italian friends, New York is not the US, right? It is its own cosmos. And so, of course, it's a large urban area with all the attendant cost of living issues, right, that I mentioned earlier, that helped Mamdani, a fairly telegenic young guy, to mobilize voter groups that were apathetic when they were confronted with the choice of Kamala Harris or Joe Biden in the past, okay? So, in that sense, if you look at all the overall successes of November 4th, yes, to be very honest, it did not only give me hope, okay? It gave a lot of Americans hope. And what you've seen, if you of course track the public opinion polls, you have seen that, people are already getting tired of Trump, okay? Trump has about a 25% in the US population of this sort of evangelical nationalist contingent, and they will vote for Trump come rain or shine, no matter what happens, okay? But then you have, of course, probably 25% of, progressives, liberals, they will never vote for Trump, no matter what, right? But that leaves still a fairly large proportion of, conservative, independents, right, that look at the effects of the government on their lives. And right now, the last year has been not only chaotic, but it has also, of course, the tariffs have led to increased inflation in the US, making products for citizens more expensive. Job losses has increased because of the tariffs, right? All the stuff that he said wouldn't happen. And so now we've seen the result of this. Healthcare. Wait till the healthcare doubles, the premiums that people have to pay doubles next year. Healthcare will be the winning ticket for 2026 and possibly 2028. Remember, it goes back to Obama introducing universal healthcare as we all know and we've all grown up with it, right? And yet it's so contested in the US, the dignity of having the ability to be healthy. So, but again, I would be careful with the problem that I see is Mamdani, again, is a New Yorker. It's just like in Athens, the Athens mayor, I don't know if he has national reputation, Mayors usually don't get to that stage, okay? So we're looking at governors. Yes, Gavin Newsom, the Democratic governor of California, the largest democratically controlled state, a country in itself. He has probably ambitions to run. But among these independent-minded middle slice of the population, there are a lot of them who would never vote for a person from California because they call California as basically like socialist Europe, and that's a derogative term. So I see a problem with candidate choices. There's Pete Buttigieg. He's a good mayor, but he served in the Marines, but he happens to be gay. Okay, and therefore he's written off by many. Yeah, I mean, women, the usual sexism, right? And then if there are women of color, like Kamala Harris, forget it. But one more point about this, and we can move on. What's really interesting, watch what's happening, and you know this from your own countries here in Europe, the split among the left. That is determining if the Democrats will win. Can they find a unifying platform between the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders types, and the mainstream Democrats? The eight ones that now Democrats that sided with the Republicans to end the shutdown, they were all moderate Democrats. So now all the progressives are literally, you know what I mean, not happy about, to say it lightly, about the more moderate wing. And this unity among the Democrats is part of their own demise, and they need to overcome that. But as you know from your own countries, many of European countries have that same split, which is just like on the right, between far right and conservative right. This is part of the polarization that we live in. It's not going to be easy to overcome that, but that will determine if the Democrats win or not.
Okay.
In my
Next one.
yeah, there were also questions back there, but also please here, whatever.
What is it?
Argentinian question.
Because you actually answered the huge extent of the question. The question directed was internal American politics. What the Democratic Party is going to internalize, if it's going to internalize at all, the recent results. Because it's as you said, it is very split right now. And this division and left unity that has been demonstrated by the MAGA movement has affected the electoral outcomes. And throughout the United States, especially in the city of New York, we saw that having an actual program that can address the challenges, especially material challenges of the people, taking a stance on issues. For example, Mondani was quite unapologetically supportive of the Palestinian people, has translated into an electoral success. The city of New York is the highest percentage of Jewish people in the United States. Despite that, we saw that he managed to reach that audience. If the Democratic Party is unable to understand what the appeal of such a movement is, and make a point out of making a part of their platform, I don't see it ever managing to galvanize support and countering the market movement. But because you answered very well, I wanted to ask you about a point you made. Perhaps as the Trump administration has been supportive of many left-minded populist movements throughout the European Union and abroad, of the possibility of the European Union affecting internal American politics. And I wanted to ask you, how do you see that happening, considering that the European Union doesn't have consensus on what the Trump's administration needs to happen? There are some very clear allies inside the European institutions right now.
Yeah.
So, how do you envision that?
No, yes, you're absolutely right. Thank you. That's actually a really important point because, but we've seen already, for example, Italy, right? Meloni has moved for, in the European Union. Her image, her prestige has risen because of Trump, because she's one of the most respected interlocutors, right? Those people, who can, she's called the Trump whisperer, right? Because she can basically talk to Trump, she has the favor of Trump, and so she can, so von der Leyen, that's why von der Leyen has built a close relationship with Meloni, because she wants to use that channel, right, as one of the working channels, because of course she doesn't want to go through Orban, because Orban is unreliable with some of the Visegrad bloc countries that we know, right? Slovakia, Czech Republic or so. So you're right. I mean, this last point that I made was a little cheeky, right? Because that would imply basically sort of using a similar guerrilla tactics that the far right is already using. It would certainly not improve transatlantic relations, but I mean, we're unfortunately in an age, if the far right is doing this already, maybe it is time for some democratic progressives in Europe to work with going to California to work with Gavin Newsom, you know, work with Governor Pritzker in Chicago, right? So basically using those democratic positions of power in the US to align transatlantically on that sub-governmental level, if that makes sense. But it would be certainly dangerous if it's more guerrilla style tactic. But listen, politics become more and more dirty in business, and so the Democrats of the world have to kind of follow that route, if you ask me. One more point about what you said about, Madame, yes, of course, but you know, I have some friends, Jewish friends, also in Miami as well as in New York, and in New York there was a lot of debate about Madame's stance on Gaza, right? And there was a lot of Jews who were very quite, you know, concerned about his stance. And as you know, foreign policy, programmatic goals usually don't change much. Again, healthcare might be the decisive factor, because that affects every American citizen. There was a bit of silence.
So you talked a lot about all the things and everything that's going wrong in the US. So
sorry.
And in the beginning, you asked how optimistic you were that there will be or there won't be a semi-autocratic political system in the US in the future. But having heard your talk and knowing the other things, for example, federalization of national guards, a lot of the political ruling being done by executive orders and decrees, selling of Trump merchandise with Trump 2028 on it, which is a violation of the re-election guidelines, which would bar Donald Trump from running again in 2028. Also coup d'etat for the Capitol in
January
20,
6th.
with the lawsuit regarding that being cancelled just because the president is not able to be prosecuted. Him obviously not accepting election results, forcing officials to find more votes or to stop the count.
Exactly.
Him only including loyalists into his government as opposed to his first term, and also internationally having a government, a secretary of war, and following kind of apologies by force. Aren't we already there? What's the difference to an autocratic government, in your opinion? Because in the beginning addressed, will we have it in the future? And we were wondering if we were why we were so optimistic. What's the difference in your opinion?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, thank you. It is the difference, right? Probably sort of between the semi-authoritarian, the degree of authoritarianism that we have, right? Semi-authoritarian or fully authoritarian. I think as long as we do have the courts, and there are still, like I said, I mean, the Supreme Court is damaged in its credibility and in its dependence on the government. But, for example, there's an argument that the Supreme Court is siding a lot with Donald Trump, right? Because they want to preserve the remaining power of the courts against Trump. Because if they would have sided against Trump, which they should have probably, right? Trump would have fought the court directly as well. Do you see what I'm saying? So one of the theories about why the Supreme Court is behaving like this is because they want to save the remaining independence that they can. So yes, I agree with you. We're moving from semi-authoritarianism into authoritarianism, right? Exactly. But then, the question is, is this irreversible or is it reversible, right? And I mean, think about the cases in Poland. I would hope, hello to my Polish friends, that, the PAS, right? Authoritarianism is sort of reversible. But we see now where Donald Tusk runs into issues with that, right? In Hungary, we have to hope for the next year's election, right? After 15 years of Orban rule, and then it will take another couple of years. So for me, the question is, yes, it's a degree of authoritarianism, no doubt about it, right? And so the differences, you can argue one way or another, semi-authoritarian or authoritarian. There's certainly strong authoritarianism already present. But the question is, will the US recover from it in the future because of its important role for the rest of the world? And this is something that not keeps me awake at night, but it I think a lot about that question.
Further questions?
That's an Argentinian question.
Please. Okay.
Oh no, there is one behind. There's a question over there.
Yes.
And of course, I'm going to sticking around if you have some other questions you want to chat with me afterwards. Right?
I think today's lecture is really inspiring. I'm from China.
Hi.
And I'm doing double degree here. So as a Chinese student and who studied international relations for like almost 5 years, and from my perspective, I think that maybe EU's current approach for aligning too closely with the United States, especially on some issues about China. Like, so I think that rather than like a lot of professors and a lot of courses that I have learned that always told that you should choose one side, China or the United States. But from my perspective, I think EU maybe should adopt a hybrid strategy, some Southeast Asian countries to maybe cooperate with the United States on security and engage with China on some economy or high-tech areas, etc. And maintain its own normative voice globally. And I think this way the EU can maximize its own interests instead of sacrificing its own instead of sacrificing its own interests. So, Professor, here is my question. So, do you think nowadays it's realistic for the EU to pursue strategic hybrid, which means balancing between the United States and China to protect its own interests, or given the political and environmental pressures from Washington? Has Europe already too deeply locked into the transatlantic framework, or we think that the framework built by the US to act independently? That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's a very good question. It's probably the most important question of the future as well, right? How will these relationships to China pan out? And can we see differences in how the EU relates to China versus how the US relates to China? Of course, it also depends on the amount of pressure that the US will put on Europe, right, to align with them. Right now, I think, given that the US has this America First policy, the US Trump administration does not really care all that much about how the Europeans relate to China, okay? The US, even under Biden, has just cared about this kind of decoupling, as you know, right? So I think that is an opportunity for the Europeans to have a more drive an independent course on China. But as you also know, I don't have to tell you this, right? With the US, for example, keeping artificially Chinese electric cars out, a lot of these cars end up in the European Union, right? So there's this trade redirection that will put the Europeans under more pressure because of US policies trying to exclude China from their markets. And I think this will make in turn, the EU-China relationship more problematic. And you've seen this, what recently happened, right, with these microchips, remember? That where the Dutch were nationalizing that company, that microchip company, and then the Chinese government got all upset about it, right? And so now they had to find a compromise. But I do agree with you. The Europeans need to stake out, as in general, they need to stake out a more independent course. They also need to stake out an independent course with China, right? And that doesn't mean it shouldn't be being with the US or being with China, right? The Europeans have to really find their independent footing. But that means reducing also dependencies on both the US and on China. And that will be hard. Because, China is needed for the big markets, the US is needed for big markets. China is needed for some resources, right? As well. It's going to be very difficult for the Europeans to do that. Theoretically, I agree with you, but how do you implement that?
Okay. Questions? Yes, you have the privilege to raise the last question.
Welcome to the privilege. Okay, thank you. I want to ask you about Mercosur and the diversify of trade agreements that you mentioned. Today in Argentine media and the press, they are talking about free trade agreement, a bilateral free trade agreement between
our both states. And I think that they are competitive, not complementary. So I would like to know your opinion about this experiment. And also I want to add my vision about what my colleague from China says. In my vision, I have more than 20 years of experience in international relations in a poor and peripheral country that now depends both from China and United States, because we have two swaps. If not, our economy will be destroyed. So I do not agree with her in the point of view from my experience and from the point of view of our reality, because China and United States both try to divide the region and compete and try to divide also not only in economic perspective but also in a politician view. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just to respond to the latter one that you said, I find it interesting your perspective in Argentina. But again, if both China and the US try to divide the Argentinians, right, that provides in theory an opportunity for the EU to say, like, we are a more reliable partner. If it works in practice, not sure. With regards to your question about the bilateral FTA to Argentina, I have not heard about this, right? Because it technically, it would be competitive and it would technically be illegal since Argentina is part of Mercosur. But then again, international legality doesn't mean all that much these days anymore, right? So in that sense, if they wanted to do it, they will probably go ahead, Trump and Milei anyway, and do this bilateral trade deal. Then they will say like, oh, WTO, who cares, right? So that's the unfortunate side of it. And the Europeans, of course, they try to stand up for the international rule-based system, but with very limited effect.
Okay. So that's all from Mar-a-Lago.
Yes.
So thank you very much.